Okay, so last time, sorry I had to blow my nose and just kind of quit there. Allergies are just killing. Anyways, last time we were finishing out talking about where we get these earthquakes. Earthquakes can happen anywhere in the world, but these earthquakes, we get shallow earthquakes, divergent plate boundaries, and smaller earthquakes, relatively smaller earthquakes. Transform boundaries also shallow; they're happening at the surface, right? Whereas shallow and smaller, anywhere from about 7 below. Whereas the big ones, anything like an 8 or a 9, is going to happen at a convergent plate boundary, and these guys can happen at both shallow and at depth. The big earthquakes that are going to be the really dangerous ones are going to be up the shallow ones, because that's where it's going to be more brittle, colder, and therefore the bigger earthquakes. These ones down here tend to be smaller earthquakes because it's hotter down there, and therefore you can have more motion. Okay, so however, we've already talked about this, but we can also have what we call intraplate earthquakes. So as I push on this part of the crust over here, it's going to have most of the stress here next to the plate, but it's still going to have stress throughout the whole plate, right? So as you rip apart more plate, you're going to have intraplate earthquakes, or old faults get reapplied, and so they're going to have earthquakes too. So it all depends upon different areas. You can have earthquakes along the transform fault at divergent boundaries, and then also collision boundaries, but also in between on occasion. But they're not going to happen as often in between. So a great example of an intraplate earthquake is in Missouri. Some of the largest earthquakes we've ever had in North America, even larger than any place, and the ones in California, was here in Missouri and Tennessee areas. We call it New Madrid fault zone, and it was so bad that we had basically 7.6 earthquakes within a month of each other. It caused so much damage in this area that it looked like the Mississippi River was moving backwards for a little while. It was just a pressure wave, but that's what it looked like to people, and that's what they describe. And the whole areas here were moved around. It was pretty devastating. The earthquake waves were so strong that bells were ringing in Boston, and I think the president at the time was President Taft, if I remember right. If you remember anything about Taft, he's the really big guy. So he actually fell out of his bed at the White House in Washington, D.C. during that time frame, and he records in his journal that he actually felt the earthquake itself. These earthquakes, so they were pretty large earthquakes that occurred back in the 1800s. Now, there's not a lot of people that lived out here during that time frame, so we didn't have a lot of great accounts of it, but there are enough out there for us to be able to understand what happened out there. But it's one of the largest earthquakes. Basically, what's happening here is these are old faults that were formed a long, long time ago when you used to have started to have a divergent plate boundary, but that divergent plate boundary failed, it stopped. But now, over here on the Mid-Atlantic, right, this plate and the North American plate are all one plate. This part's oceanic crust, this part's continental crust, but the whole thing's being pushed this way. Well, there's a plane of weakness right here, and because of that plane of weakness right here where the Mississippi River is, that's why the Mississippi River is there, by the way, because there's a plane of weakness there, the river can cut through it easier, and therefore it actually stations that there. That's why you have the Mississippi River Valley there. Anyways, so those faults get actually reactivated, and therefore you can have earthquakes throughout these regions. Okay, that is a place that we could potentially have some really large earthquakes today in the future. Well, what impacts how severe an earthquake can be? Okay, we talked about here where an earthquake could, those waves were felt all the way in Boston and in Washington, D.C., but also throughout this region, right? So what can make an earthquake worse in one location more than another? Well, there's a lot of factors that come into play for this. Okay, some of the biggest factors are its location, the length of the fault, how much of that fault actually ruptures, how deep it is. If it's shallow, it tends to be more stronger because it's, first of all, in the brittle part of the crust, but also because the seismic waves are closer to the surface, so they don't dissipate as much. The further down you go, you tend to get less strong earthquakes at the surface because the energy dissipates as it goes up, but also it's in places where you have more ductile material. The geology has an impact on that. If we have materials that that bend, they're going to actually absorb the energy more. The geology that doesn't bend is going to make the waves go through it faster. So it depends on where you're at. Also, the time of rupture might impact this. Let's say we had an earthquake during rush hour. We don't have rush hour around here very much, but during rush hour versus maybe in the middle of the night, right? In the middle of the night, people are going to be home, in bed, and usually in structures that can withstand shaking. Wooden structures that most homes are made up of can withstand shaking better than commercial buildings often, because the commercial buildings are made out of brick or cinder block or something like that. They're not as resilient to shaking. They'll break up faster. And so they tend to be more dangerous during that time frame. So they'll impact severity of the damage associated with the earthquake itself. The location has a big impact. Let's say if an earthquake happens here in Pembroke, it's probably not going to have as much damage. It's probably not going to have as much loss of life as if it happened in New York City, downtown New York City. Or for a great example was Haiti, right? We talked about Haiti in the 2010 earthquake. That caused 200,000 people to lose their lives. Well, that earthquake happened in downtown Port-au-Prince, which is a pretty highly densely populated area that caused, and the people of Haiti were not ready for it. They did not have their structures built for earthquakes, and therefore there was a lot of damage and a lot of death. Okay, so building construction can have a big impact on this. Whereas in Japan, even larger earthquake than Haiti, it was a 9 instead of a 7. And there was not very many people that died from that. It was only a couple thousand died from there because they were ready. They were prepared. They were populace. Were taught about it. They had their buildings constructed for it. So they were all prepared for it, and therefore they didn't have as much damage, and they also didn't have as much loss of life. So a lot of these impacts can occur. They can be intrinsic to the actual earthquake itself, the location of it, the depth, the magnitude of the earthquake. A 9 is going to be more damaging than a 2. Geological conditions, so is the path of seismic waves going through harder material or softer material? Usually going through, if you're on a place with harder material, it's actually better in a lot of ways because the waves can travel through you faster. Whereas if you're in softer material, it actually will slow down the wave and therefore amplify the wave. And so that makes the impact. If you have saturated soils, it's going to make an impact. And so we'll talk about that one in a little bit later. Okay? Societal issues we've already talked about. Construction, populace, all those kind of things. Okay? So, why, in some places the geology makes an impact. The waves can get amplified. For example, if we have an earthquake in this area here, that wave will go through that hard rock really quickly, so there's not very much amplification. But it will go through these other materials that are softer, and it will slow down. Well, the energy keeps coming in, but it's slowing down, and so what happens, the wave gets amplified. So a great example of this is during the Loma Prieta earthquake. Some people call this the World Series earthquake because my San Francisco Giants, which is their baseball team there, were playing the Oakland A's, which crossed Bay rivals during this time frame, and the earthquake actually went off during the World Series. And I actually remember watching this. I was watching the World Series. I can't remember which game it was. I think it was Game 3 or something like that. And I was watching it, and all of a sudden the whole screen started moving around and stuff like that. And so what was happening is there was an earthquake during the World Series, and the actual fault goes right next to the stadium. And so there was actually damage on the stadium. Nobody died in the stadium. It's died elsewhere, but nobody at the stadium. And so you could actually watch the earthquake as it went through the region. Now, what was interesting about this is there's different geology underfoot. So up here where it has bedrock, the waves went through it very quickly, so the amplitude or the amount of shaking wasn't that much. But once it got to this gravel and the muds, where it slows down, the amplitude would actually increase. And because of that amplitude, there was a lot more shaking in those areas than in these other areas. So for example, there was these two-tiered highways. The way these highways work is the northbound goes in this direction, the southbound goes right underneath it, and then they go over top of each other. They design these in areas where they don't have very much room, and so they do this to actually maximize the room doing a double tier or double stacked highway. In this case, it only broke right here in these places where it had the muds, because there was more shaking there than it was in other places, therefore causing more damage. So these are what we call shake maps. These are the intensity, how much damage there occurred, that you can see in these different areas. Notice this is where the earthquake occurred, but where you had more shaking or more damage were up in these areas down here near the valley, where you have more muds and things like that. So you had more shaking in those areas than you even did at the epicenter. So being at the epicenter sometimes is not bad if you're in a place of hard rock, because that hard rock will actually cause the waves to go through it much faster than the other waves. Okay? And so these are just some examples. This is the Loma Prieta earthquake that happened, the World Series quake, where you had up here in San Francisco having a lot of the damage, even though the epicenter was way over here. Whereas this one here, what we call the Northridge earthquake, a lot of the damage occurred right next to the epicenter because the material in which it was in enhanced the shaking in that location. Another example of this is if we had an earthquake, let's say we had a 6.7 earthquake. I think this one is the Loma Prieta, the Northridge earthquake back in 1994. It was a 6.7. Well, the waves could be felt all the way into Nevada, but more intense right there in California, of course. Okay, and however, if we had that same size earthquake, we had that earthquakes in Missouri back in 1895. That 6.8 earthquake actually could be felt all over the eastern United States. Well, why is it that over in the western United States it only goes a couple, about 200, 300 miles, whereas in the eastern United States it's going about 1,000 miles in some aspects? Well, it has to do with the hardness of the rock. Back here in the eastern United States, we have this thin layer of rock up at the top that's nice and soft, but everything below it is this nice little really thick craton, right, that actually transmits the energy through the eastern United States much further than it would in the western United States. So if we have an earthquake in the western United States, it stays more local, whereas if we have them on the eastern United States, they actually get spread out, so for a much larger region. Okay, and so, for example, this is part of the reason why earthquake risk in the eastern United States can be greater, because they travel further throughout the subsurface, whereas in the western United States they don't travel as far because of the geology underfoot. So if you look at this map, this is the map of earthquake risk. What's the potential hazard, different risk that we have for a different region? Now, do understand that there is a difference between risk and hazard. Okay, a hazard is anything that could actually cause damage. So, for example, I could walk down the stairs and trip and fall. That's a hazard. Okay, risk is more than that. Risk actually encompasses the hazard plus the vulnerability of the individual. Okay, so for example, me falling down those stairs would hurt, and I could even break my leg, right? But if I had a 90-year-old man who was the stairs and he fell down the stairs, well, he is going to have more risk because his bones are more brittle, and therefore he might actually die from the event, whereas I might just get a broken leg, right? Okay, so he's more vulnerable to it than I am, and therefore the risk is greater for him than for me. Okay, the same thing goes for anywhere around the world. Some risk is greater in some spots of the world because of the other conditions that apply in those regions. So this is earthquake risk around the United States. We have more risk along the western United States because it happens a lot more frequently. Okay, and they can become very large. Whereas the eastern United States are not as frequent, but when they do happen, they can go for quite long distances. So therefore, you tend to have still high risk in some localities. So for example, around Missouri. And notice also around Charleston, South Carolina. They actually have more earthquake risk than other places as well.